Hey everybody! What I want to talk about today is the distinction between subcultures and countercultures, as well as think a little bit about some of the different ways that cultural change can occur. So let's just get right into this. Now, the first concept that I want to talk to you about is subculture. This refers to any group within a much larger population whose values, norms, folkways, or mores are in some respect distinct from the mainstream culture. So it's some group that just does things a little bit differently. They have their own set of values, their own way of doing things. You can think about this as a larger scale version of almost like inside jokes. You know how when you have a close group of friends who you speak with ordinarily, how you start to adopt similar manner of speech, you have a shared set of references and jokes and things like this that outsiders to the group don't quite get? That's effectively what a subculture is, right? So this can be something like, as in the picture here, the polyamory community, who's focused around having romantic and sexual relationships in which people have more than one partner. You could also think about something like fandoms, right? Whenever you're with a fandom, there's usually a certain set of memes that people use, different terms that one another would rapidly recognize, but outsiders wouldn't quite get. That's what a subculture is. And it's quite possible to be a member of several different subcultures at the same time. Membership within a subculture doesn't usually disqualify you from membership in the more mainstream society. These are generally seen as being almost like sort of quirky things that you do, quirky groups that you're a part of, something that's maybe a little bit unusual from other people's perspective, but it generally is not seen as threatening or something that needs to be cracked down upon in any way. One way to think about this, and a good definition, comes from Dick Hebdige. Hebdige has a little bit of a more radical interpretation of this. Hebdige suggests that subcultures are actually a symbolic form of resistance. That by belonging to, participating in, adopting the style of some sort of subculture that is distinguishable from the more mainstream cultural conventions, you're actually forming some sort of resistance to the dominant capitalist society. Now, I put this out here because I think it's an interesting point of view, right? It certainly gives a lot of power and authority to the kinds of subcultures that you might belong to or be interested in. I'm not so sure, however, if I agree with Hebdige in this. This seems like it's actually going a little bit too far, particularly in our current moment in time where culture has very much fragmented and we don't really see very much in the way of a shared common culture. Right? We have some remnants of this. Certainly the media corporations are trying to create more of one. Certainly the governments would like to create more of one. But at the same time, however, we see this great celebration of individual expression and of people, following whatever tastes they're interested in and so on. So I'm not sure. I feel like Hebdige is actually a little bit too optimistic or romantic when thinking about this. But I put it out there because I think it's an interesting thought about what these subcultures are. Now, countercultures are a bit different. All countercultures are subcultures, but not all subcultures are countercultures. Countercultures are distinguished by the fact that they are strongly opposed to the larger culture. There's things that they value, there's things that they do, things that they believe in, certain ways of going about the world and relating to one another that are actually opposed to mainstream society. By enrolling in a counterculture, you're signing up for something a bit different than when you're signing up for a subculture. You're living a very different way of life. And a great example of this would be a community like the Amish, right? The Amish will dress in a way that immediately distinguishes them from most other people in the West. Oftentimes, they will speak something like Pennsylvania Dutch or German or something like this, some sort of language that is separated from American or Canadian society. And of course, most dramatically, they voluntarily choose to forego many of the modern inventions that we use every single day. Right? When you're signing up to be a member of the Amish, to the extent that people do this, you are abandoning mainstream society. You are going for a completely different way of life. Another example of a counterculture would be biker gangs. Right? If you become a member of something like the Hells Angels, you are setting yourself up quite literally as an outlaw. Right now, of course, not all bikers are criminals or countercultural in any radical way, but when you're a member of one of these criminal organizations, you are living according to a different code than most other people around you. Right? One of the things we often see in countercultures is an intense attachment to and pride in the fact that you are not doing the same thing as other people, that you are living by a very different value system. This is something which is not just limited to the West, right? All across the world and throughout time, we've seen a wide variety of different subcultures and countercultures. This is just one example here. So this is the Tropicalia subculture in Brazil. The adherents of Tropicalia adopted a completely different aesthetic from other representatives of mainstream Brazilian society. Their goal was to try to bring in cultural influences from all around the world, including from Africa, and to develop very different styles of music from what was being promoted in mainstream society at the time in Brazil. Right? And you can see these sort of things all across the world, various levels of subcultural and countercultural behavior. And what counts as subcultural or countercultural varies depending on the context. For example, one of my friends did his graduate research on the consumption of comic books within Francoist Spain. So Franco being the military dictator of Spain who ruled for several decades. And to read comic books, just simple like Marvel comics, which is about as mainstream as it gets in Western culture right now, was actually a bit of a radical statement, right? It was showing that you were opening yourself up to these Western American ideas, that you were not adhering to the intense traditionalism of the Francoist regime. So that's something that's very interesting to think about, right? Where do we see countercultural behavior today? What are the groups that are saying to the values that are being espoused by our governments, by our major media corporations, the values espoused within the films and television shows that most people consume, the values espoused by most of the celebrities that are touted as being popular and people who we should model ourselves upon. Where do we see countercultures today? What's countercultural right now? And I encourage you to just think about that. Countercultural doesn't necessarily mean good, but it does mean different. To some degree, countercultures pose a challenge to the mainstream society by their very existence, insofar as they often draw attention to some of the contradictions or some of the problems that the dominant culture doesn't want to address. So it's something that's interesting to think about in our current time. Now, we can see that culture is constantly changing. This is one of the reasons why what's countercultural in one point in time may become completely mainstream later. Right? Like, I hardly think that reading superhero comics in Spain right now is seen as being a countercultural move as it might have been in the 70s. Right? A great illustration of just how culture changes comes from when you look at people's hairstyle or clothing and how rapidly this shifts. Right? What's seen as being sort of the main normal default way to do your hair actually signals a lot about the time that you're in. And so here's an image right here that I like quite a bit, which shows like the makeup and hairstyle and a little bit of the fashion of the United States in each decade of the 20th and then the beginning of the 21st centuries. You can see that over the last 100 years, things have shifted quite a bit. Right? The makeup, look at the different forms of lipstick, the different ways that she has her hair, even the different expressions that she's making. Right? A lot shifts over time. And this is something that isn't just true in the United States and Canada. We can also see similar shifts taking place in locations like Iran. So this is showing the equivalent thing for a woman in Iran from 1910 into the 2010s. Right? Some really radical transformations over the last 100 years. So this is sort of a mundane example, but it is like a small piece of the bigger picture. Culture is changing constantly, and it's changing on a wide variety of fronts. So the question is, how does this happen? What is the mechanism by which these cultural changes occur? And sociologists suggest that there are three main ways that this takes place. Cultural change typically happens as a result of discovery, where the culture comes across something that it didn't notice previously. Right? It discovers something new about the world, something new that has significant cultural changes. And we'll look at some examples of this in a little bit. The second way is through invention or innovation. So this is where existing cultural items are changed, modified, built upon in some way. So you can think about the ways in which music tends to evolve, right? We very rarely see new musical forms emerging out of the blue. Generally, what we see is one group is inspired by another, who then inspires new groups in return. Right? People are constantly riffing off of one another, remixing things, pushing different trends a little bit further than the people who came before. The third cause of cultural change is diffusion. This is a term that just means things shifting from one group to another. Right? So ideas trickling in, almost being spread in a kind of viral way. Right? We see this happen very quickly online, where ideas and phrases and memes rapidly shift from one person to another, so that it's hard to tell even sometimes where it initially came from. Here are a few examples of this. A great example of discovery would be when Europeans discovered tomatoes. Right? This was not something that existed in Europe. And of course, tomatoes are now a core component of many European cuisines, most notably Italian cuisine. Right? So it's kind of hard to imagine now to think about Italian cuisine without tomatoes. But it's only after this discovery of North and South America that these things actually were even brought over to Europe, and that Italian cuisine as we know it could come into being. You can think about a similar thing with the indigenous peoples of North America when horses were brought over by Europeans. Right? And horses fit perfectly into the cultural practices of many of these indigenous groups on the Western Plains. It fit perfectly into their way of doing things, and so it became a major part of their culture. Right? It became horse people in many cases. A great example of invention, just as to think about technological invention, would be the development of the smartphone. This, of course, had a huge impact on culture and basically everything. Right? Think how much we do that is mediated now through these devices. This image, I think, really powerfully illustrates this. So the top image is showing the, I'm not entirely sure what the term is, coronation, inauguration, the day that Pope Benedict was unveiled. I'm sorry, I can't really think of the term right now. The bottom is from when Pope Francis in 2013 was, welcomed to the world. You can see the crowd is interacting with the event in a completely different way. And I think back in 2019, back when we were still allowed to go to concerts in the before times, I went to see the band Tool. And this very interesting thing happened where throughout the whole concert, there was a prohibition on using smartphones. Right, so the security would come over and bother you and potentially kick people out if they kept trying to take pictures or whatever. It was awesome, actually. The whole concert was everyone was just interacting directly with the music, with the band itself. And then for the very last song, the singer said to the audience, he was like, "Okay, you can take out your phone now." And almost everybody took their phones out, and the whole vibe changed. It was quite amazing to see. From my perspective, it was horrible, but it was fascinating as a little social experiment. You could tell he knew exactly what he was doing. And so the invention of this device had a huge impact on everything from, how you keep track of your children to something as simple as if you're having a discussion with someone else over a fact. And you're like, geez, what was that movie back in that day? Who was that actor? Nowadays, if we have a question like that, we just immediately look it up. It's impossible to have the kinds of intense barroom arguments over matters of fact that used to be commonplace back in the day. Right? So from things like that to your experience in concerts, this invention has had a huge cultural impact. A great example of diffusion would be the spread of yoga all across the world, and indeed the spread of most major religions across the world. I got another example of this, a historical example would be the spread of Buddhism from India, where interestingly, Buddhism is very minor right now. That's India, well, I guess technically Nepal, but it's spread a lot through India, and now it is almost absent from India. It is certainly not one of the major religions in India at the moment, although it is there. Buddhism spread from India into China through effectively people getting little Buddha statues and thinking they were cool. Much as they are in the West, where lots of people who are not Buddhist or who are doing it sort of purely for aesthetic reasons will get little Buddha statues. That was sort of the foothold of Buddhism into China. And then people would start going on little meditation retreats and so on, until it reached a point where Buddhism became one of the dominant religions in China. We see this sort of diffusion of cultural practices happen all the time. And one of the things that we often see is the diffusion of cultural values and fashions and styles and music from subcultures and even countercultures into mainstream culture. Right? It's often those countercultures and subcultures which don't have to worry about the standards of mainstream society, which are free to develop a lot of new things because no one really cares about them, because they're total outsiders from mainstream society's perspective, who are able to develop a lot of the most interesting things. Right? So, for example, some of the first women to hold property in the United States, some of the first women to espouse or to embody many of the things that we now would associate with very highbrow feminism, were madams, which is to say, women who ran brothels. Those were some of the first powerful property-owning women in the United States, because they were outside of mainstream society. They didn't have to worry about gender norms and conventions, because they were already seen as being effectively moral reprobates by mainstream culture. And so they were able to do things very differently. And eventually, of course, this practice became widespread. Right? It's often when you look to those countercultures that you see the engines of cultural change. It's pretty interesting stuff, I think. Now, there tends to be what we call a culture lag between cultural changes and their widespread adoption by mainstream society. And we see this even with regards to new technologies. Right? Often, this curve sort of represents how things tend to spread within societies, both with technology and I would say with cultural innovations as well. There's always a group of cutting-edge people, right? The innovators who are coming up with this new stuff, who are really on the bleeding edge. They're onto it before anyone else has ever heard of it. Then there's the set of early adopters, sort of the first part of mainstream society who gets a hold of it. The people who are really in the know. And they maybe will start writing articles or popularizing things. Then the majority comes on. Finally, there's always the laggards, the people who lag behind the rest. Right? Whenever culture changes, whenever some major shift in values or practices happen, it always takes time for it to spread throughout society. Almost nothing happens at once. A great example of this would be the slow adoption of the zipper. You can see the zipper was first patented in 1893, but it wasn't really until the 1920s or 30s that its use actually became widespread. And you would think that something like the zipper, which is so obviously useful, would catch on quickly, but that wasn't really the case. So, to end things off here today, I encourage you just to think about how culture has shifted within your own lifetime. Right? All of us have seen cultural changes. Think about how have things transformed within the world around you, within the world that you grew up in. Things change with respect to the way people eat, the things they drink, the way they drink. Have things changed with respect to religion, spirituality, politics? How have things changed with regard to clothing, hair, makeup? How have people entertained themselves differently? Think about what was the cause of this change. Was it because something new was discovered? Was it because of innovation? Or was it because of this diffusion practice of things shifting from one culture or subculture to another? All right, thanks for your time, everyone. Take care.